Hi everyone, Jason B here. So today I want to talk about discrepancies in coverage between Rachel Maddow of MSNBC and Sean Hannity of Fox News. And I want to talk about it through the context of the first indictments issued by Robert Mueller of Russians in his investigation into the 2016 election interference. So pretty much the indictments were for trolling and a propaganda effort set up by the Russians in that's laid out very clearly in the indictment. They not only did they troll people online and uh, wage propaganda warfare, trying to get different parts of the American electorate angry at each other and trying to rile people up, but they even went so far as to set up events on Facebook that actually took place, anti-Clinton rallies, for instance, that real people actually showed up for. So, yeah, as I said, I want to highlight Hannity versus Maddow's coverage comparison. And I want to talk about propaganda because propaganda is biased or misleading information that is specifically used to push a particular political point of view. And it's used in a way that's not in good faith. And between Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow, I think only one of them meets that criteria. Rachel Maddow has political viewpoints, but I am a firm believer that the Rachel Maddow show is not propaganda, and that Sean Hannity absolutely is. His show on Fox News, I believe, does fit that bill. So both shows, the Rachel Maddow show and Hannity of Fox News, are on at the same time. They come on in the same time slot every night, every weekday. And one thing I found interesting is these indictments were handed down on February 16th of 2018, and Rachel Maddow, as I said, she's on at the same time as Sean Hannity. Rachel Maddow covered the indictments in detail the same night. Oddly, very oddly, for someone who is supposed to be a news anchor, or at least that's the way he presents himself, Sean Hannity did not cover those indictments on February 16th. Sean Hannity ran a full hour on a recent school shooting that night. Um, uh, Sorry, he ran his full hour that night on a school shooting that had taken place recently. I don't believe it was even that day that it happened. And then on February 17th, Hannity comes back with a full hour pretty much talking about the indictments, but with a very specific slant. So I found it to be quite suspicious, and I will detail that further as we go along in the video. Okay, so I'd like to start off by talking about Hannity's coverage. So he comes on the day after the indictments have been handed down, and I'd like to focus on his monologue. I was able to track his monologue down on YouTube. And so he starts off and he puts up a graphic that says Trump's vindicated, Trump vindicated. And he talks about a statement by Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who is in charge of Robert Mueller, who's running the investigation into Russian interference. And Rosenstein gets up there and is very factual and very precise in saying that there are no Americans involved or being accused of any wrongdoing in this indictment. And I think that those three words, in this indictment, are very crucial. But Hannity seems to take that as if it means no collusion. We've seen that from President Trump quite a bit. No collusion. Um, and he really jumps on it. And he sort of co opts this statement for propaganda to push a biased political point of view, omitting several facts. First of all, he's ignoring the reality that Rosenstein could be fired at any moment by Trump. Um, that's something that we all need to appreciate. He's running the investigation in the least biased way that he can, at least from my perspective, and he is towing a line. You know, he wants the Mueller investigation to be able to get as far along as possible and for all the relevant information to be found out. And he's not going to come out and say in an indictment that doesn't have anything to do with Americans, he's not going to come out and say there's no evidence of wrongdoing of any Americans in this indictment, but President Trump's not off the hook. He's just not going to do that. In addition, this was just the first round of indictments in terms of interference that we saw. And we had indictments previously that had to do with the Russians, but this was the first of Russian nationals where the U.S. Department of Justice was accusing them of attacking us via cyber warfare. And it was and is an ongoing investigation. How can someone be vindicated in the very early parts of an investigation? It makes no sense. But as we see, and as I saw from studying his monologue from that night, he wanted to jump on anything that could be used to satisfy his core audience and Trump's base, that what Trump had been saying about no collusion and witch hunt and all of those things, that it was just this false media narrative being plotted out. Because as Rosenstein said, no Americans accused in this indictment, but in this indictment is crucial. And he just skips right over that, but uses it to try to further his political agenda. So then Hannity moves on, and then another graphic comes up behind him that says Hillary's dirty dossier. And he also refers to it as the Clinton bought and paid for dossier. So just to quickly introduce what the dossier is all about, it was about a 30-page collection of memos from a former British intelligence officer. It came out in 2016 at some point, I believe. Maybe early 2017, it was published by BuzzFeed. And it had a lot of allegations about Trump and the Russians, and a whole litany of wrongdoings were alleged in this document. And right-wing media and Hannity and Carter Page, who I'll talk about a little bit, they have really hung on to this dossier and have tried to paint it as a Democratic plot to undermine the legitimacy of Donald Trump. And there are quite a few issues with that line of thought. So first of all, what we have to understand is this was not originally Hillary or her team paying for opposition research on Donald Trump. This is very misleading. A group tied to John McCain, it was a right-wing group during the primaries that initially hired Christopher Steele, the British intelligence officer. They were the ones who started paying for this dossier. It was not Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton's team did eventually pay money for this opposition research. So it's very misleading to just completely omit the fact that a Republican-leaning group, they were the ones that started this. Second of all, it's not phony at all. Much of it has been corroborated. A lot of the allegations have been corroborated. And maybe I'll come back and do a video on that at some point soon. But what I can tell you is that more has been corroborated than has been disproved. Okay. Third, another suspicious thing, dirty dossier. Carter Page, who we've now found through subsequent indictments and legal documents, there is a high probability that he's been co-opted by the Russians. He uses the same term, dirty dossier. So it's like, who got it from who? Did Carter Page get that from Fox News? Did Fox News get that from Carter Page and maybe his handlers? We've seen evidence of this weird loop between the president and his associates and Fox News, and then we've seen weird links between right-leaning groups and such as the NRA and Russia, and it's all really suspicious in my opinion. So that's just something to think about. Um, but then Hannity goes on to say that, quote, in referencing the dossier, that, quote, Russian government sources peddling Russian propaganda lies to influence the American people. That is very misleading. Christopher Steele from the MI6, the man who authored the collection of memos known as the dossier, is a source who has worked with our FBI plenty of times. He's a source that is trusted and highly respected by the FBI. When he says Russian propaganda and Russian government sources, what he's referring to is Christopher Steele, who is a leading Russia expert who worked for the MI6 in England. He spoke with many on the inside of the Russian operation because he spent lots of time in Moscow and developed many sources and things of that nature. He was a veteran spy who spent years developing sources, and he understood that some of those Russians may be lying to him, some of his sources, but with the degree of confidence that he had for such a veteran who's highly respected by the FBI, um, it's very misleading to call it. They might have been Russian government sources, but to peddle Russian propaganda, I don't think that someone as respected as Chris Steele would put his whole reputation on the line to peddle Russian propaganda. He, in the report, says that between 70 to either 80 or 90% of the information is highly likely to be true. He has a high degree of confidence, and he lays that out in the report, and that's how intelligence reports work. So, while it may technically be true that these were Russian government sources, these were people within the Russian operation that a highly respected veteran spy trusted to a certain degree, and that's how he assessed the situation. It wasn't just Hillary hiring some British spy to peddle Russian propaganda from Russian sources willy-nilly. There is a way that these intelligence agencies go about it. And that's just the point I'd like to make on that. So then Hannity does a pivot to Uranium One, which was a big talking point for him and some of his fellow opinion hosts on Fox News for a while. Essentially, Uranium One was a baseless allegation against Hillary Clinton that she sold America out to give uranium to the Russians in, I think, 2009. And it's been debunked, but he tries to conflate the Uranium One scandal, not really a scandal, but just a propaganda tool. He tries to conflate that with 2016 interference and says if anyone colluded with the Russians, that it was Hillary. So this Uranium One thing was debunked by fellow Fox News anchors. If you want a good recap on that, you could check out Shepard Smith's response, where he lays out fact by fact why Sean Hannity is completely lying. And essentially, Hillary alone, even if she had the worst intentions and was trying to sell the United States out to the Russians by selling them uranium, she could not have made the decision alone as Secretary of State. There was like 8 other departments and department heads that had to sign off on whatever the dealing was exactly, and it couldn't have been just her. And I highly encourage people to look up Shepard Smith's response to the whole uranium one thing, because it's a whole crock of BS that was used at convenient points by people just like Hannity for propaganda purposes. So then Hannity moves on to the mainstream media. He shows clips of other media outlets talking about the Russia investigation, saying how serious of an attack on our democracy this was, things of that nature. And it's clearly an attempt to make these other outlets look hysterical or conspiratorial. And he really takes very selective quotes, he takes them out of context and tries to paint the other media outlets as just being out to get Trump. And I think it's really ironic that he's trying to paint other media personalities or reporters as conspiratorial when Sean Hannity was one of the people that pushed the Seth Rich conspiracy, which, for those of you who don't know, Seth Rich was a DNC or Clinton staffer who was murdered in Washington, D.C., and Fox News, or a portion of Fox News, tried to make it out that Hillary had him killed because he had some sort of information that would have been bad for Hillary or Obama or whoever. And the fact of the matter is that there was an investigation and it had nothing to do with Hillary Clinton. The DC police, they investigated it, and it was just baseless claims, with Hannity and people like him just grasping at straws. And it's just ironic that Hannity, and I should also mention that Seth Rich's family, I think they possibly sued Sean Hannity for pushing this conspiracy and saying, and they said, like, stop using our son's death for your political purposes. And he was forced to stop talking about it. So it's just very hypocritical that Hannity is trying to make these other outlets look conspiratorial with very selective quotes, and taking context out of the picture when he himself spread a baseless conspiracy accusing Hillary Clinton and her team of murder. Um, and then some of the clips that he shows of other media outlets talking about the Russian interference, some of these other outlets, and remember, these are very selected, out of context quotes, talk about how it's pretty much the 9/11 version, but of cyber warfare. So it's an attack on the scale of September 11th, but cyber warfare. And he takes these out of context quotes. He doesn't put what the people say afterwards, but he cuts it a certain way where it, makes them look hysterical because, America lost 3,000 citizens. And I think these other outlets were simply saying that in a cyber warfare context, it was on a similar scale as that terror attack, but he is using that to try to make others look hysterical. But it's interesting though, because later on in his monologue, he quotes Devin Nunes, a very pretty much a Trump attack dog in Congress based on his actions. He Nunez says that he said in 2016, failure to predict the Russians' next move would be an intelligence failure on the scale of 9/11. So it's interesting. He's trying to make all these people look hysterical. But when Nunez makes a quote, someone who's in bed with the president, and I'm assuming in bed with right wing media, when Nunez makes a quote that mentions it being on the scale of a 9/11, he accepts it. He doesn't fight back against it. He doesn't attempt to use loaded language to make Nunez sound like he's a nut job or anything like that. So it's very interesting how one-sided and how focused Sean Hannity is on trying to get at the mainstream media. Not to mention that he's on Fox, which is a mainstream channel. Hannity moves on and brings up a graphic, and it says, "Where was Obama?" He cites NBC News, of all outlets. He cites NBC News in a report that said Obama didn't do more before the 2016 election to alert the public about Russian interference because he thought Hillary would win. And the reason I'm sort of incredulous that Hannity is citing NBC News is he usually deems it as fake news. Just, him and President Trump, they call NBC, ABC, all of them, they're fake news. But when it's good for their case, it's not so fake anymore. So it's interesting. Why didn't Obama do more? Well, Obama tried to do certain things, but it was made difficult. Obama wanted to release a bipartisan statement alerting the public of what was going on leading up to the 2016 election. And Mitch McConnell, pretty much, he would not release the bipartisan statement with President Obama. He said that if Obama went public with what they knew about the Russians trying to influence the election, that he would paint it as the Democrats making excuses, as being partisan. He wouldn't cooperate with Obama in this sense to give the public crucial information that they should have had. And plus, it didn't help that Trump had been crying that the whole thing was rigged the entire time. This would have fed directly into that. Also interesting is when we ask where was Obama, uh, the right wing media and Hannity, Fox News, they when they talk about Carter Page nowadays, they say, "Is it acceptable that Obama was spying on an American citizen? He's trying to take away our civil liberties." Well, as I've mentioned, Carter Page has been nearly proven to be a Russian agent. They've been monitoring Carter Page since, I believe, 2013. So they say that Obama, he shouldn't have been spying on an American citizen. He's trying to get at Trump. But at the same time, they're saying he's not doing enough to try to catch the Russians in the act. I'm just a little confused about that. When you try to have things both ways like that and you're being intellectually dishonest, that is propaganda. Just plain and simple. So then Hannity goes on. The next graphic, Weissman's sketchy past. So Weissman is one of the leading prosecutors on Mueller's team. And Hannity brings up that Weissman had made donations to Democrats before. But funny enough, he omits the fact that Rosenstein, Comey, Mueller, they're all Republicans. All of them. And I would bet they've made political donations in the past to Republicans. But he omits the fact that those three key players in the investigation are Republicans because it doesn't fit his narrative. And then another thing, he's bringing up Weissman's sketchy past, as he likes to put it. But then, and trying to say that, he's not transparent or he's got an agenda. What about Michael Cohen being Hannity's lawyer? He had Hannity had Michael Cohen, who was Trump's personal attorney and fixer, who has since been charged with felonies and who was cooperating against Trump in the Mueller probe. Um, Hannity had the man on his show, never disclosed, never said a word that this guy had served as his attorney at certain points. And if he would have disclosed up front that Michael Cohen had served as his attorney, this wouldn't be so egregious. But just the fact that he's making these accusations against Mueller and his team, well, he has his personal lawyer or one of his personal lawyers on his show to talk about how innocent Trump is and how crazy everyone else is about this whole Russia thing. He had him on his show, no transparency. So it's quite the double standard. So now I want to talk a little bit about the way that Maddow of MSNBC covered these indictments. So I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible, but please bear with me while I draw some contrast with her and Hannity. So Rachel Maddow reported on the indictments the same night, February 16th, 2018, because there was no need to create spin. She was reporting the news as it came. She also made mention of Paul Manafort, who that same day, court filings came out suggesting potential bank fraud, that the properties he was looking to put up for collateral for bail, and this is Manafort, former campaign manager for Trump, that those properties were insufficient for bail because they were flagged for potential fraud. This is a man who left Donald Trump's campaign due to pro Putin lobbying ties in Ukraine, and he attended the Trump Tower meeting. So at this point, on February 16th, 2018, there was no concrete evidence, but it would be odd if Manafort was not involved somehow with the Russian influence campaign and the trolls, because he had spent his entire career as a lobbyist and, in his own words, as an influence peddler, shaping public opinion for dictators all across the world, and most notoriously for Viktor Yanukovych, who was well known as a Kremlin and Putin puppet in Ukraine. So that's why Maddow was reporting on it. She was trying to uh, talk about all things relevant to the investigation that had occurred that day. Hannity skipped right on over this. And I'll remind you that Trump had even said, according to NBC News, I can't remember exactly from who, but it had leaked that Trump had said that if Manafort flipped, which he actually recently did, but I digress, if Manafort flipped, that he could really hurt Trump. So all of these sketchy things that were going on were pertinent, and Hannity skipped right over them, and Rachel decided to report on them. So then Rachel Maddow, she talks a little bit about Mike Flynn, about Rick Gates, George Papadopoulos, just generally making the point that the special counsel does not leak. He runs a tight ship on his investigation, and she doesn't say much about them, according to the transcript that I tracked down of her show on the day the indictments were handed down. But she turns her attention from talking about the special counsel and how his operation is run to a man named Pinedo. I think it's Richard Pinedo, and the 13 Russian nationals. So this was interesting because Pinedo is an American, and this directly contradicts what Hannity was saying on his show at the exact same time slot. Pinedo was complicit in fake identities and bank accounts for Russians that were used to set up events, that were the fake identities that were used to sow discord on social media. This Pinedo guy, I believe from California, he was involved. So this is another critical fact that Hannity misrepresents and just omits, completely takes out of his monologue because it didn't fit his narrative. There was American involved. It wasn't in that indictment. So technically what he was saying was true, but that same day, Pinedo's involvement was reported. And then what Rachel Maddow proceeds to do after talking a little bit about the special counsel and the lack of his leaks and how he's a man of surprises, um, talking a little bit about Pinedo and an American being involved in these alleged crimes from our Department of Justice. She goes on to detail in a logical order, what the indictments are all about. She does not skip around and use loaded language to paint a narrative, like Hannity, who does so in defense of his patron, Trump. She goes straight through, she reads from the court filings, and she just tries to explain what was happening on that day, February 16th, 2018, with 13 Russian nationals and 3 Russian entities being indicted. So it was just it was just Maddow laying the facts out versus Hannity, who spent a full extra day preparing what seemed like a lawyer defending his client. Maddow clearly goes to a level of specificity that her Fox News counterpart just doesn't do. Maddow does her due diligence. She does not cherry pick unless you think that talking about the Russia investigation is cherry picking in itself, which is ludicrous in my opinion. And she stays factual. She goes to the court filings. She talks about what's actually going on rather than trying to distract with Uranium One and jumping around from this to that. She's just sticking on those indictments, not the dirty dossier, not Uranium One. Maddow frames the indictments as an attack on the US public via propaganda warfare, which it absolutely was. Hannity, this early in 2018, he's changed his tune since, but Hannity seems to agree in this video, but he muddies the waters. He muddies the waters by putting up tweets by Trump that say no collusion and witch hunt and saying that Trump is vindicated and this and that, instead of just following the facts where they might lead. Another contrast is Hannity makes his hour of television that night all about Donald Trump, while as Maddow hardly mentions Trump. She mentions people related to the investigation, but not Trump himself. Maddow seems to know the overall investigation, of course, has to do with Donald Trump, but she has her eye on the ball. She's focusing on what's relevant at the moment, what's relevant in the information that had just came out hours before she went on air. Whereas Hannity is focusing on the man that he knows he must defend, or at least it seems that way. Because what I got from watching his monologue is Hannity just really wanted to focus on how these indictments had nothing to do with Trump, had nothing to do with any Americans, because he ultimately has a political point of view that he is being intellectually dishonest about in trying to communicate Trump's vindication or innocence. So just to kind of sum everything up, Sean Hannity, he wants to defend his guy. I think that much is clear from watching his show from February 17th, the day after the indictments came out. Maddow, she wants to cover the actual legal documents and the charges themselves. Only one of them reported on the news the same night. That was Maddow. They're on the same time slot, had the same amount of time to prepare, but Maddow covered this part of the investigation that night. Well, Hannity waited a full day so he could seemingly come up with his defense for Trump. He used a school shooting as a distraction for a full hour the night prior. And this is not the only time this has happened with Hannity or Fox News. It's right out of their playbook to try to use fear to distract at least long enough so they can come up with their version of the truth. That is propaganda. Please hit subscribe. It's going to be an elephant and donkey symbol that represents the Democrat and Republican parties. That'll be at the bottom of your screen. I'd love it if you'd follow me on Twitter at JasonBPolitics. And I hope everyone has a great day.